peak body for volunteering in New South Wales. Grow communities and bring people together through volunteering.
Welcome to the Local Legends podcast, where we share stories of untold community spirit. I'm your host, Charlotte Busler, and joining us today is Inclusi's Vicki Mayer, a champion for virtual volunteering. So Vicki, tell us about yourself and your involvement with Inclusi.
Yes, so thank you, Charlie, for having me on your program today. So my professional background is predominantly in the not-for-profit sector. So I've had a range of roles which I'll go through, but my journey for me probably starts as a child. So my mum in particular was what we would call today an informal volunteer. We didn't realise it was an informal volunteering. It was just helping out a neighbour or helping out the community. And so I've really had that kind of community spirit and making a difference in the community ingrained in me. It's been part of the fabric of my culture. And moving towards, sort of teenage years, did some formal volunteering as part of the door knock appeals with Red Cross and the Salvation Army. I knew I wanted to make a difference, just wasn't sure where or how and what that looked like. And so probably in my early 18s, 20s, I was involved in ministry, so working in a paid capacity, but also volunteering quite a lot in that faith-based community. And it just cemented for me even more that I want to make a difference. And I was fortunate to get my first not-for-profit role outside of a ministry position at Ronald McDonald House, and eventually became the manager of the house in one of the houses in Brisbane. And from there, it's just grown and evolved. So I've been fortunate to be Community Engagement Officer for Volunteering Services Australia. I've been a HR coordinator for World Vision, project coordinator for Volunteering Queensland. I sit on a board and a management committee, so Story Dogs and Friends of the Koala. And I also, I have that opportunity to continue volunteering, which I'll touch on through virtual volunteering. And as part of Volunteer Victoria, I'm also a mentor for new volunteer managers and coordinators. So that has sort of those diverse skills, working with Volunteering Queensland. I've had the opportunity to support and lead volunteers as part of my role operationally, or as what I'll go into now in the case at Inclusi, where it's my sole focus. So about 3 years ago, I saw a role advertised through a recruitment agency for a manager of volunteer services. The information in that ad really aligned with what I'm all about and how volunteers are change makers in our community. And the mission of the organisation just sounded wonderful, reducing isolation and loneliness for older Australians through the power of technology. It just sounded so unique and I wanted to be a part of it. I went for the interview with the recruitment agency and I got a second interview with our CEO, Rachel Cook. And I was just blown away by everything the organisation was achieving. I hadn't seen anything like that for older Australians, but also for volunteers. And the culture of the organisation just exuded through Rachel. I was like, I want to be a part of it. I don't want to miss out on this role. And it's that culture has been demonstrated from that interview right through today. It hasn't shifted. It's a wonderful culture. And so I got the role and I was the first manager in the department. So Inclusi has been operating since 1973. It has evolved and changed over the years. And they've always empowered volunteers to help them on that journey. But this was the first role where there was a designated manager to help grow the department and support volunteers into the future. So I spent the last 3 years almost helping to build frameworks for our volunteers, different support mechanisms, but also grow our own department. So I have 4 volunteer support officers and myself. And that honestly is a testament to the organisation's investment around their volunteers. So that's a little bit how I got involved at Inclusi, and a little bit more about myself.
That's fantastic. And it sounds like you've had a great experience and helped a lot with the organization. Could you tell us about the journey to adopting a virtual volunteer program that Inclusi champions?
Yes, so with Inclusi, as I mentioned, they have been operating since 1973 and did have a physical site. And around about 4 years ago, our CEO, Rachel Cook, was appointed. And she really took the organisation into a journey of growth and empowerment. So with the support of the board, it was looking at how could the organisation greater impact the community. How could we serve our participants in different ways? How could we also give them dignity of choice? So in the aged care sector, there are a lot of in-home visiting programs, but how can we give older Australians a choice where they can connect in a different way? And so Rachel was fortunate to have the opportunity to innovate the face-to-face process that we had in the program, involved a range of stakeholders on the journey, including our volunteers, and we started transitioning over to digital visits. And so today, as part of that, we have a Connect to One program where we will match a volunteer with a participant. So participants are older Australians on the programs with us, and they will have 1 hour weekly sessions primarily over Microsoft Teams. We have a Learn to Tech program where we will support participants to really gain confidence using technology, reducing the fear and barriers of technology, but also supporting them in learning new goals and skills that they would like to achieve. And we do that by a volunteer mentor who works one-on-one with them, also over primarily Microsoft Teams. And then we have our virtual community centre. So at Inclusi, we're all about building community and having people join in. And so one of the ways we achieve that is we give participants that space where they can drop in at any time if they want to have a chat. So they might have a Connect to One visitor, but that visit might be on a Monday and they really want to talk to someone on Wednesday. So they can drop in, have a chat, stay on for 5 minutes or 5 hours if they really want to. And through the Virtual Community Centre, we have one of our newest programs, which is Interest to Enjoy. So we have online clubs for small groups of participants on a range of topics. So we, at the moment, have 33 different online club sessions a week, and it ranges from travel to trivia. We have meditation, well-being, and men's shed. So a lot of variety and impact. And we haven't been able to achieve this without our wonderful support of volunteers. Our programs are volunteer-led, and they're really the drivers of change in reducing that isolation and building friendship and rapport with older Australians. So it has been a wonderful journey for us. It has allowed us to also look from the volunteer perspective around what could we do differently. So we know in Australia we have a decline in volunteering. We know there's a lot of challenges facing individuals who want to volunteer, but who may not be able to. And that could be at the moment, there's additional pressure with our community on finances. So people are taking on second jobs, which means they don't have time for traditional face-to-face in-person volunteering. We know that time and red tape are those barriers. And so one of the great things about this journey of having a virtual volunteer program is we've been able to come together as a leadership team and as an organisation and say, what could we do to be proactive about these barriers as well? And having greater opportunities of roles where volunteers can connect almost on their own terms. So it is mutually agreeable around session times. They have the option for after hours. They have the option of weekends. We've also introduced non-participant facing roles so they can do it any day and time that fits in with their schedule. So it's really about dignity of choice for our participants, but also dignity and greater choice for our volunteers to connect in new ways. And that's been one of the amazing things as part of that process. To get to adopting a volunteer program, of course, we have to look at different avenues and how we support that. So we introduced a CRM, customer relationship management system. So we use HubSpot. As I mentioned, we now have a volunteer services department and frameworks in place to really support them in that as well. And we're continually reviewing that. How can we make the volunteer experience and journey more engaging? What can we do differently? In my role, I have been fortunate to be on the RAP committee for Reconciliation Action Plan, but also the organisation is currently on implementing a KIND group, and that's really looking around neurodiversity in the workplace. So how do we align that with our volunteers as well, so that there is a safe space for them to come and volunteer as they are and empower us to reach our mission as well?
That's very exciting to hear the way that Inclusi is embracing new opportunities and doing things that might not have been done before, or thinking outside the box in a way that we can include more volunteers and also include more people that you're trying to help in the community. And it's really exciting to see that, because when you start, there's a ripple effect in the sector of how can we also keep improving and thinking of new ways to do things. And with embracing this technology, it seems like you have like a lot of great diverse programs, which is fantastic. How do you stay connected with your virtual volunteers, given that it is so flexible and that you have such a diverse approach?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because the engagement, communication, and connection has also been a journey for us. And we've had volunteers at one point where they really just want to connect with their participant. They don't necessarily always want to engage fully with the organisation. And part of that is because the type of role. So at Inclusi, we have identified that we have probably over 50% of staff who identify as neurodivergent. And so we anticipate or estimate that we probably have similar in our volunteer cohort as well. And that does change how people want to engage and what they want from their volunteer experience. But what we have been doing to help build that community is we have a monthly newsletter that goes out online. We have what we call a monthly support review. So if you were volunteering in person, we'd go, "Hi, Bob, how was your session today? How did it go with Betty? You're amazing. Great. Let us know if you need anything." And we could do that face to face. We can motivate, engage, and offer that support. In a virtual community, that is a little bit different. Our staff and volunteers are all remote, and so we have to think about different ways to achieve that. So the monthly support review email, or they can opt in for a call, is that check-in. So, how are your visits going? Are there any concerns you want to raise? They can provide feedback, which will launch a feedback ticket and a whole process around that. Or they can opt in for a one-off call. So they might not want to call every month. And that's what we've discovered from our volunteers. We used to call them every month, and they said, "Look, we're at work, we have this, we don't have time." So we've gone into that email, or they can opt in for that call. We have a Polixen mobile workers app, so they can log their hours in that app. We have the roster set up in there for them, and they can just log any additional comments to come and connect back to us. We also obviously calls and SMSs, but our primarily main point of communication has been emails. And we're looking at changing that. So this year, our team have worked really hard in volunteer services around how can we engage, but also give volunteers the choice in how they engage back with us. So we don't want it to be one-sided. We want it to be mutually beneficial, and we want it to work for them. So some of the things we've implemented is Kindness Crew. So our volunteers are called Kindness Crew. We have a Kindness Crew community twice a week. So we have 2 Zoom sessions. Volunteers can just drop in. They can ask for questions, concerns, support, but they can also chat with their peers as well. And so that's been one of the things we've implemented. We also have book a call link now. So in all our email communication, there's a link. People can click on that link to book a call in at a day and time that actually suits them. And that just reduces the back and forth of, when would you like to catch up? I'm free this day. I can't make it that day. So once again, giving them that independence to book at a time that works for them. We have launched a new learning management system called EdApp. and we love it. That's a really exciting project for us here at Inclusi. And we want to offer micro learning that not only helps them in their role, but also in their professional or personal life. But one of the great things that EdUp we're trying to use as a feature is we have banners. So it's communicating information, having links in there that they can link back to surveys and things like that. And we've started an advocate program where volunteers can come and give us feedback on set topics. They'll have more power around decision making on how the program looks moving forward. And one of the newest exciting things is kudo boards. So it is still an email, but it's a lovely special email. And we've been utilizing that for a number of things. So if there's a significant event happening in the volunteer's life, it may be a welcome anniversary for their service here at Inclusi. And the great thing about that is we've asked the wider team to send messages. So if you're face-to-face, you might have an organisation that has a feedback jar for their volunteers, or they might have cards that they send out. For us, we do that via kudo board. So it's not just volunteer services saying you're amazing. It's the wider team coming on that journey and celebrating our volunteers as well. So they're just some of the ways. We have a volunteer summit every year, so a conference for our volunteers. They receive conference packs. We have a limited number for early bird registrations. There's no cost for our volunteers, and it's a wonderful day of personal and professional development, but also meeting with their peers, so bringing them back to their community at Inclusi. So lots of different ways to communicate and engage, but really exploring that for 2024 and how we can do things differently through those mediums.
And I love to hear that. It sounds like there's a really considered strategy around engagement, internal communications. And I love that you bring up neurodiversity because it can be an area that isn't always touched on. And I love that there's that relationship between, a workplace and a volunteer team is that, if you can be accessible in your workplace, you can be accessible to your volunteers and vice versa. And that's really great to see that. And I would love to talk about some of the misconceptions that people might have around virtual volunteering, and with it being, virtual volunteers might not be as connected because it's not face to face. From your experience, seeing your virtual volunteers, how they engage with people in the community, what have you seen? What would you say to that misconception?
Yeah, I think some of the challenges around that can be also how the volunteer involving organisation has set their program up to be. So with that, it's looking around what does your volunteer cohort actually want, whether that's virtual or in person. It's a little bit like a reward and recognition strategy. You don't do a one size fits all. You listen to your stakeholders and really try to understand what's bringing them into the organisation, what they want to achieve, and how you can work together to achieve that so it's mutually beneficial. So with our volunteers, it really is around the connection methods you're trying to build, and people will be less engaged if you're not giving them an opportunity to engage. If you're not giving them a voice, then they do become voiceless and they can disengage quite easily. And that's not just virtual volunteers, that's volunteers in the in-person environment as well. So I really challenge organisations to think about how they go around maintaining that contact and that communication, and setting clear guidelines of what you expect from each other as well is really important. We know staff and volunteers, there's a higher risk of turnover during induction because people are unclear around their role and where they fit into the organisation. And so all the best practice that you're doing in an in-person traditional volunteer program, you should be translating into a virtual environment if you're considering a virtual volunteer program as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think another concern people have when they think about going virtual is that when they're reaching out to some communities like older generations, they might think that it's not accessible, that might be a barrier. What has been your experience with Inclusi? Because, that is what you do is, a virtual program with older generations.
Yeah, so from the participant side, we do find that participants come to us and there is either a fear of technology, or they haven't had the experience and exposure of technology, and we're here to support them with that. So that's the aim of our program, to give them that confidence so they can remain independent, they can remain connected. From the volunteer side, it's a bit like isolation and loneliness. We have to get over the stereotypes that we build in our mind. So with isolation and loneliness, when we think of an older Australian, we think of a little old lady sitting in her chair, sad. And look, that may be the case for some, but you can have a strong network around you and still be isolated and lonely. There are things you may not want to discuss or share with your family that you need a listening ear in another space. And it's very similar for our volunteers as well. So we do have a diverse range of volunteers from 18 well into 80s. And, it's about not assuming that someone of a certain age can't be involved in a digital virtual volunteer role. With anyone applying, it's about asking what their skill set is, what their level of comfortability is with technology, and seeing how we could support them on that. But we have a large demographic of volunteers over 65 with us, and they engage with us in a virtual platform. So it's just about knowing your volunteers, but also seeing what reasonable adjustments they may need. So just because someone is of an older demographic, it doesn't mean that they can't participate in a virtual volunteer program, but it's making sure it's accessible for everyone.
Exactly. And I love to hear that. And I love to hear that, it's about not making assumptions, and that you don't stop at the barrier, that there are ways to, as much as possible, bring them down if they exist. And I would love to know more about, with your volunteers, what is the impact that they are having in the community? What are you seeing from your virtual volunteer program?
Yes, I think that's a great question, Charlie, because sometimes when we think of virtual volunteers, we don't always recognise the impact that they have. And I think part of that is, in Australia, virtual volunteering is still quite new. A bit like work from home is a little bit still new. And I know the pandemic has driven that change for a lot of organisations. But it's about recognising that they can still contribute and impact. So at Inclusive, what I love is the impact that our virtual volunteers do get to make. And they get to make that partly because we have flexible roles. So it does mean someone in the community can say, I want to volunteer. I have barriers like work, family commitment, study. How can I still be involved? And in Inclusive, they can still be involved. And so what we have seen by having that virtual volunteer program is feedback from our participants, which I'll share some feedback in a moment. Our participants are getting immense impact from the program, which is what we want. Our volunteer feedback is that they've been experienced during COVID isolation themselves. So this has given them a way to volunteer, because they may have been in another role where they were stood down because their volunteer program closed. It has given them a sense of purpose and impact as well. So we've had, as I mentioned, 33 weekly clubs as a result of our volunteer facilitating. But we've had a total of 93,096 connections. We've had, from March, 56,260 volunteer hours. We've had 74 special events and programs that have been possible because our volunteers. We've had well over 76,359 hours of conversations, and that was just in 2023. So this is all possible from our volunteers. We've also had the lowest unmatched participants in record of the organisation. So what that means is a participant comes on our program and says, I would like a volunteer who might share these interests and hobbies, and I would like to connect with them maybe on this date, or I'm open to that. And we will, as I mentioned earlier, match a volunteer with the participant depending on the program. And so as a result of that, as a result of volunteers saying, I want to be part of your community, we had the lowest unmatched participants waiting for a volunteer, as I mentioned, in the organisation's history. And that was around 6 participants at the time who were waiting for a volunteer. and they've since been matched. So that is huge, and that's because of our volunteers. So we've got from our participants, we have Anne, who's in our Learn to Tech program. Anne has said, "There's nothing negative to say about this program. I can connect with people in my family because of Learn to Tech. Otherwise, I would be isolated. I appreciate Inclusive's generosity and help throughout the program. It is helping me keep connected and from isolation." We had Jenny, and Jenny said that her phone calls, so she's having phone visits, her phone calls with Robin are wonderful, and she looks forward to every one of them. She thanked us for finding such a perfect match, as she and Robin have so much in common. Jenny is grateful every day for having found out about us and meeting Robin. And we find that our volunteers with our participants really do build that friendship and that rapport, which is wonderful to see. We wouldn't be able to do it without them. We've got our corporate partner, Telstra. Now, Telstra, as you know, obviously are all across Australia. And so if you think about a corporate impact day for an organisation that has complexities of sites and locations, virtual volunteering has enabled them to do that. So they're part of our Learn to Tech program, and they support their employees to connect with an older Australian to go through their Learn to Tech session. We've got RACV and Colin Biggers Paisley also on our corporate group. So it allows flexibility for even corporates to come and join in a way that's meaningful and purposeful as well.
That's fantastic. It sounds like you're having an immense impact in the community and bringing in so many people, because virtual volunteering is accessible to so many people. And we know from our experience at the centre and from our conversations within the sector that having a diverse volunteer team is a really great strength. Could you talk to that, how having a virtual volunteer program might have allowed for some diversity and inclusion in your volunteer team?
It certainly does. Virtual volunteering makes volunteer opportunities more accessible. That could be from a geographical basis. There may not be either roles or the type of roles volunteers are looking for in their local community. So it does allow them to branch out, but also build up their experience. So we've had many university and TAFE students that have been able to engage with us where they've found it difficult to find placements in their local community. And the feedback we've got from them about how that's empowered them and given them confidence for their future career is just so heartwarming. But it also allows, as we touched on before, volunteers who might be neurodivergent, volunteers that might have either mental or physical health impairments, they're able to connect and enjoy and join in on their own terms. They don't have to worry about accessibility, and no one should have to worry about that. But we know it is in the back of people's minds. If you're living through that and that's your experience, you face discrimination in a range of different ways. So you shouldn't face that as a volunteer. So it gives them that safety net and that comfort that they can be themselves. We're looking at things around pronouns extending to our volunteers and a diversity and inclusion strategy for our volunteers moving into 2024, 2025. We have volunteers from different cultures, particularly at the moment we have participants who are seeking Greek-speaking volunteers, and so we always need and love Greek-speaking volunteers come through the program, but we have volunteers from different cultural backgrounds as well. It allows them to safely enter the world of volunteering in a new way. And so we have found it's been quite beneficial to the volunteer as well. We are changing and updating our onboarding process as well. So reasonable adjustments is a big thing for us at Inclusi, and providing interview questions prior to a volunteer interview so people can have time. We recently had a Russian-speaking volunteer who applied for a role, and she disclosed that she's really great with written English, but for spoken English, she didn't have as much confidence, she disclosed to us. So we were looking at how we could make that interview process really welcoming and safe for her, but not just her, anyone. You shouldn't have to ask for reasonable adjustments. We want to make it a standard thing that anyone can access. So it definitely allows volunteers to explore opportunities in a safe way that they may not be able to for a range of different reasons. And we're really excited about that.
Yeah, and that's really heartwarming to know that that's happening in the community. And I think, yeah, bringing up language, having a diverse volunteer team allows you to meet the diverse needs of the community because, if someone's just come to the community and maybe they don't speak that language, it's reassuring to know that they can reach out to Inclusi and have that access. What advice would you give to someone seeking a virtual volunteer role?
Yes, just sorry, Charlie, just before I'll backtrack.
Yeah.
Part of our diversity inclusion as well, we, as I mentioned, have launched our learning management system, EdApp. One of the great features about EdApp, which is what appealed to us, is that the micro learning courses that you have can be changed into different languages. So if we have a volunteer that might speak Mandarin, we can actually change that micro learning course so that they can learn in their native language that they might feel comfortable in or prefer to learn. So it's also looking at different learning styles and abilities in that as well. So it's not a one approach to learning, but just love in particular the language feature in EdApp. I should disclose this is not a paid promotion for EdApp. It's something we're so excited about. So that's another wonderful addition that we're making here at Inclusi.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And knowing that diversity, inclusion, accessibility is at the forefront, not just in terms of recruiting, but onboarding, including them once they've got their foot through the door is really great to hear. And it sounds like there's a lot of benefits to being a virtual volunteer, especially at Inclusi. I'm very jealous. What advice would you give to someone seeking a virtual volunteer role?
Yes, with virtual volunteering, it's about understanding why you may want that role. And it depends from that what you're seeking. If it is that perhaps there's not a local role that really appeals to you and you've seen something online, that's fantastic. So some tips I would say to anyone considering virtual volunteering is to consider what they would like from that. Depending how the organisation has set up their either virtual or hybrid program, sometimes you can be working more autonomously rather than in a team. That will suit some people really well where they want that more autonomy. Perhaps there's social anxiety and they don't necessarily want that teamwork as well. So understanding what the organisation offers to know if you're really social and they don't have a lot of virtual social gatherings, it's probably not going to necessarily appeal to you. And knowing those things can allow you to ask in the interview or when you're submitting an application around what the organisation does offer around communication, teamwork, engagement, so you can make the best decision for you. And also another tip would be what support you might need. So if you are fine, for example, working autonomously, but you really do like feedback, you might be a marketing volunteer and you're working on some marketing content. For you, it might be really important that you get feedback and guidance on if you're going in the right direction, if you're doing a great job. We know it is a right for volunteers to receive that feedback, but it might be more important to you. And so asking in the interview what type of feedback do they give, how often do they give feedback might really help you determine if it is going to be the right fit for you. The other consideration is around equipment. So a lot of virtual volunteers, you do need to use your own equipment and obviously access to internet. That can be offset by if you were to commute into an in-person role. Obviously, there's a cost to commuting, or if you need a volunteer uniform, then there might be a cost associated to that volunteer. But just understanding if you're okay to use your equipment, what that might look like for you. But also, do you have a safe space to volunteer? So it might seem really great. You found this online role, you're really keen to do it, but do you have an environment that is conducive to volunteering from home, that is safe, and that you do have the equipment to make sure your health and well-being is also safe and taken care of as well. And think about time. So we know virtual volunteering is great because it offers flexibility, but there still is risk to overcommitting in a volunteer role. And we see that a lot because volunteers, they have hearts of gold. They want to give, and they give so much to our community. I often hate to think of a world without volunteers because it would be a very sad world indeed. But even though it's minimal time, is it still realistic for you at the moment? Even an hour a week, can you fit that in realistically? So you're not setting yourself up to fail and you're not also impacting the organization. And then another tip I was reflecting on this morning actually is around asking. We don't ask a lot. So you might see a perfect role, but it's not offered online. Reach out to the organisation to say, look, would you consider a virtual volunteer? Do you have capacity? Or if you're currently volunteering for an organisation and perhaps for whatever reason you'd like to maybe look at a virtual role, ask them if they would be able to transfer that role into a virtual environment or offer another role perhaps. So don't be afraid to ask. It might be no, or it might be a not now, but you won't know if you don't ask. So that's another great tip. And just thinking about what you expect from the organization and if it will align with what you're looking for. And these are tips that should really be applied also when you're looking for an in-person volunteer role, but definitely in a virtual or hybrid, it's things to consider as well.
Yeah, and those are fantastic things to think about. And in terms of you are an organization promoting a volunteer role, what advice would you give to an organization looking for those virtual volunteers?
Yes, so I really challenge organisations to think about if they could adopt either a virtual volunteer program or perhaps implement a hybrid volunteer program that has the opportunity for virtual. It's something I think some organisations fear. It's a big change. It seems like there's a lot involved, and there can be a lot involved. There can be little. It's as long as I always recommend you're in line with the national standards for volunteering involving organisations. But you can make it as fun and engaging as your resources allow you to do. So some tips I would say is have a look at the current roles you have and what possibly could be a virtual volunteer role. So a lot of the organisations I've had communication or association with in the past, they sometimes go, oh, we don't have a role we could go outside. And I'll sort of ask, do you have marketing volunteers? Do you have volunteers that help with the volunteer program? Do you have social media volunteers? They're some of the easiest roles that potentially can go into a virtual environment. And so challenging them to think about that. And if there is a role that they think, yes, let's advertise, let's go for it, virtual volunteering is amazing. For me personally, it allows me as a full-time employee to give back in the community because it is a virtual role. Otherwise, I would have the same challenges that some of our volunteers face. But it's not a magic pill. So I don't want to disappoint anyone by virtual volunteering is going to solve all your organization's challenges around volunteers, because it won't. It won't necessarily solve recruitment and retention, which I'll touch on, but it will open more opportunities for you. So some tips for them to consider is how will you engage and support virtual volunteers and what resources do you need to do that? I think from word go, it's good to have that clear. So when you start engaging volunteers, you can outline those expectations, but also the benefits and the support that the volunteer will achieve from that as well. Consider systems and communication. So will they have access to systems from a personal computer? That's obviously up to security and your leadership team. Or is it a role where they don't need access? It might be they're working on documents, they can send it back. So considering things like that and intellectual property, how that's managed. Safety and check-in is a big thing. We don't want you to have virtual volunteers and then almost forget about them because they're working behind the scenes and you might be in an office and you don't see them every day. So safety and check-in is a big component to consider and think through. As I mentioned, the clear guidelines, but think about reward and recognition. What you might be doing if you have in-person roles may not translate into a virtual capacity if you're going to have hybrid. If you're looking at 100% virtual volunteers, consider then what reward and recognition you could do. And sometimes it can be challenging. because when you hear about reward and recognition, it is always, or in most cases, in the viewpoint or the lens of an in-person traditional volunteer program. And that a morning tea in person isn't going to translate. Do you do an online morning tea? Maybe, but it depends on people's availability because you're doing flexibility. So think about different ways of reward and recognition and how you go about building community and connection. And as mentioned earlier, reasonable adjustments should be considered for all volunteer roles, regardless if they're virtual or in person. But if you're worried about risk, one thing you could do is, if you have some volunteers in your organisation already, it could be marketing, social media, the HR volunteer roles. You could pilot a virtual volunteer program with some of your existing volunteers and see what works, what the challenges are, and then choose to scale up if you want to and recruit outside as well. So there are a few tips, but we know, there's over 56,000 registered charities in Australia. We know many in the not-for-profit empower and engage volunteers on their mission. So what can an organisation do to make their program stand out? And virtual volunteering can be one of those ways where your program will stand out to potential volunteers or corporate volunteers as well. So don't be afraid. My biggest advice is don't be afraid to consider it and look at the possibilities and opportunities it could bring to your organisation. I think it's wonderful. I'm a huge advocate. I love it. But we understand it's not for everyone as well, and that's okay. It's not for all volunteers. It's not for all organisations. But don't let the challenges potentially drive that fear. Look around what realistically it could bring to your organisation and to your volunteer cohort as well.
That's awesome advice. And I think a great point about, it doesn't have to be for everyone, but you can have that conversation. You can think about it, and who knows what might happen, which is fantastic. And what I'm hearing is that virtual volunteering has a lot of great benefits to the organization, to the volunteers, to the community. What is one thing, if you could point down one thing you want people to know about virtual volunteers?
Well, I think that it's hard for me to always put it in a short term of one thing. If I had to say one word, amazing. Virtual volunteers are amazing. They make just as much impact as your in-person traditional volunteer role. And they're just as committed and dedicated and passionate about the cause. And I think that sometimes that gets lost in the message when we talk about virtual volunteers. We're giving people greater choice in how they donate their time and how they use their skills. And for me, I think organisations really should either look at the prospects of how maybe it could help them engage volunteers. I mentioned before, obviously, around recruitment and retention. So you might have a volunteer who needs to exit because there's greater commitment. They can't commute 30 minutes in. Offer them, have a chat with them about a different role that they could do. Learn why your volunteers are coming in. If it's to gain that experience, you are going to have turnover, regardless if it's a virtual program or not. If they're hoping to gain some experience as part of that volunteer journey for a career, then they will leave for a career. And you want to, I always like to say with our team, we rejoice over that because you have helped them gain that career or gain the confidence to pursue that. And so our virtual volunteers are just amazing, just as passionate, just as dedicated. They're just volunteering in a different way. That's all it is. They're just as special, just as amazing. And I know that was more than one word. They are. And look, it's a trend. I think people sometimes think virtual volunteering is a trend for the younger demographic. We know social justice, social media type kind of roles can really appeal to the younger demographic. But as I mentioned, we have, all ranges, middle-aged, older Australians engaging in virtual volunteering. So it's because they have an opportunity to give back in a way that suits them in a time that meets their needs as well. So it's a wonderful, wonderful way to engage volunteers and to help them give back to community. So give it a go. That's what I say. Join in.
Fantastic. I love everything you said. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences with virtual volunteer programs. It's very exciting to see it happen and know that it's happening in the world, in the community. And thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise and insights for us.
No, thank you so much for your time today, Charlie, and for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate it. And to all the volunteers out there, thank you for what you're doing, and also for all the leaders and champions of volunteers. Thank you for what you're doing in the sector as well.
You've been listening to Voices of Volunteering, presented by the Centre for Volunteering. For resources, tools, training and news, head over to our website volunteering.com.au.